Okay, let's explore marriage in a nutshell. And with great thanks to my wife, I've been having a couple of new perspectives recently that have shifted. Contextually, I grew up in a household that was painful and traumatic enough that I didn't want anything to do with romantic relationship until I had my head together. And so my plan was to learn life skills when I left home at 17. And I figured I'd have life skills mastered by the time I was 30. And at that point, embark on what seemed like a much more complicated adventure to learn to relate intimately and healthily with another human being. And I didn't like either of my parents in their marriage in a number, in different ways. I didn't like the way they fit together. And so a lot of my initial lover relationships consciously went against that. And so, for example, my mother and father's primary relationship seemed to be sexual. My mother was, in many ways, a dependent child financially and didn't, want to balance a checkbook or things like that, and liked to live kind of in a fantasy land. My mother, as part of that fantasy land, would lie. This always hurt me a lot. And so, I veered, and my father was also, as I reflected on it later, probably about 6 years old emotionally, and very vindictive because he was not a happy 6-year-old, and this culture didn't know how to love him. And, so brilliant mentally, but, spent a lot of time tormenting everyone around him and not taking any responsibility. It was always the children's fault. And so my first relationship was with a 58-year-old woman. I figured one of us ought to know what they're doing. I got to the point where I felt like I'd mastered life skills by age 26. I had just finished building my second house. And I do generally think that, relationships are important enough that it's given that we raise our children to be emotionally illiterate, traumatically illiterate. We don't teach them about the intergenerational abuse systems in the family, nor do we teach our culture about its intergenerational cultural wounds and traumas, whether it's slavery or women's rights. There's a lot of veneer that we put over these realities, and in many ways, I think, our culture is in denial. And so, a culture that's in denial about its historical and global impact tends to be in denial about its impact on children as well. So, so I approached it rather logically. I didn't want a woman to be dependent on me in the way that my mother was dependent on my father financially, because I saw that it hurt both of them. And so, kind of doing the opposite. I've never lied to a woman. I've never cheated on a woman. My father did both. My mother did both. And so kind of going the opposite seemed like a healthy template. And I was traumatized quite a lot by the age of 6 myself. And my parents would play psychological games and then laugh about them, whether they were abandonment games, I'm never coming home again, or taking us out in the forest and walking away and then enjoying us crying, because that was funny to them. And I think abused parents connect with their inner child through a sense of desperation and helplessness that is so painful that rather than feel that grief and really work through it in an emotionally illiterate culture, it's easier to identify and just switch into becoming the perpetrator than it is to work through that. And the masculine and feminine template in the male and the female is initially set by the primary relationships. And so there's an interesting thing in dissociating from that pattern. There's a blessing in terms of the medicine of doing something very different than the family. But the way I look at it is there's a regressed little girl inside me that has something to do with my mother. And there's a regressed little boy in me that has something to do with my father. I don't consider either of them to have been adults. My mother has matured somewhat, in her 50s and 60s. But there's still, if she doesn't want to deal with impact or something, she just brushes it away. And these were the things that hurt. And so I was sensitized to the negative aspects or the negative consequences in relationship, and they split up, and neither of them were particularly happy, as I don't think you can be unless you learn to father and mother the inner selves on the inside, and then learn to do that in the outside. And so my first paradigm for romantic relationships was an opportunity. I think that the falling in love and maturing of relationship process is a microcosm of the macrocosm that is one's childhood. And the beauty of this is you do have the chance, if you're conscious and use technology, to interrupt or steer that development process in a different way. And that was my primary filter. It wasn't sexual attraction. When you're traumatized and then shamed for being traumatized, and then somewhat isolated, and then you're just kind of dumped out in the culture as men don't really have feelings and don't like talking about them, it's a complete setup for emotional incompetence. And so what I initially realized was that if we did it right, there was a rebirthing. There was a new part of me, a new inner child, so to speak, that was born in the falling in love process. And then a new adolescent that could grow up. But that the default pattern was there so that it would follow that rut unless it was consciously interrupted. And this consciousness requires language requires communication. And so what I, have, generally looked for is someone who was interested in vulnerable, transparent communication so that we could kind of navigate that process together. And this means going through psychological states and stages that the culture has largely abandoned. The culture has largely abandoned its children, if we examine it in any depth. I've done that in many hours in other areas, but it's largely abandoned its children with the premise that they should grow up and then they become worthwhile human beings, and all those experiences just fade away. Not so, particularly when trauma is in play. And so what I would look for is often a woman over 50 years old who loved her little girl inside, because it's the feminine side in American men that is beat to shit the most. In a chauvinistic culture, masculine traits, assertiveness, communication, making money, getting things done, keeping busy, being popular, being outgoing, all these masculine traits are deified and exonerated. And the feminine traits of art and introspection and being introverted and psychological awareness and poetry and feeling vulnerably, these are the things that don't fit the stereotype of an American male. And what that means is not that American males don't have, as much of a feminine side as everyone else. It's just a feminine side that is ignored, shamed, presumed not to exist, punished when it does exist, and rewarded significantly less in a chauvinistic culture. You reward masculinity, and you shame or minimize or patronize femininity. And the feminist movement has gotten around that by proving that to a large extent women can be as masculine as men and occupy the roles traditionally occupied by men. And I certainly think that that's a good freedom to have, but it still doesn't address the fact that women are not honored and valued for their feminine side and their feminine roles, whether it's teaching or nursing or child rearing or relationship building or team building or joy in the moment. The feminine side in the psyche is undervalued significantly. I'd say it's 30%. It's 3 to 1. And parents, when they brag about their daughters, to me, always brag about their masculine traits. I've never had an American parent come up to me and say, "Wow, our daughter has just developed extra sensitivity. I'm so proud of her." It's always, if there's a bragging going on, my daughter's in charge, a masculine role in a vertical hierarchy. My daughter's in charge of, she's got 300 men working at her and she doesn't take shit. And it's like, okay, you're proud of your daughter for being masculine in a masculine role. Nothing wrong with masculine competency and all of that. But if your daughter doesn't even get to be validated for being feminine in any way, and if men are actively humiliated for their feminine side, the feminine side is treated like dirt, first by the culture, and then in the helplessness of a child not being able to fight an entire culture, the wound gets internalized, and the males develop a chauvinism, as well as the females. The males and females develop a chauvinism of active hostility towards the sensitivity, the emotionality, particularly emotional depth. And it's considered weird, which is completely, if you think of order and normal, that's masculine. Everyone's supposed to follow a script. That's masculine. Being weird is a derogatory term, but what it means is unique, individual. And so if the masculine is order and structure, then the feminine is chaos and spontaneity and presence and emotion and sensitivity and a sense of wonder. Innocence is one of the most profound and powerful feminine states in men and in women. And it is routinely violated, humiliated, shamed. It's turned into gullibility. Look at that fool. And there's almost a way where we admire the rapist or the criminal or the witty one that made the other one look dumb, rather than standing up for the one that's being violated. And so it's We admire the criminal that got away with the bank heist. They violated trust. They robbed or raped something and took it. But they did it with a calculating sociopathic strategy. And when you value competency more than relationship, this seems admirable on some level. They pulled off a good job. And so, and same in the military, they systematically blew up, the enemy more efficiently, or the ranks, the drill and the precision, all masculine traits. And so this chauvinism hurts women enormously because it gives a message that they're less valuable at birth. But the feminine side in men has a harder time of it because a man is basically told that they shouldn't have a feminine side, that this makes them weak, less of a man, etc. So women are presumed to have a feminine side and presumed to be less than, but they can't help it, right? They're women, is kind of the message that I've received in media and general humor, etc., growing up. But men, there's something wrong with you if you have a feminine side. And what this creates is a desperation in young boys and men to kill off, rape, humiliate their own feminine side, so as to be very clear that they side with the chauvinistic cult. And this is a very deep wound. When you kill off a part of yourself in order to survive, to have a sense of security, to feel a sense of love and belonging, and to have some sense of self-esteem. When your first 4 human needs in a chauvinistic cult are predicated on the suppression, secrecy, abuse, and denigration of half of who you are, your feminine side, there's a very deep wound there. And it's clear by the time you're 6 years old that you're going to be laughed at, looked at, poked at, told to toughen up, not quite satisfactory. Certainly to dad, often to mom as well. And this, when you've been hurt and traumatized, you're desperate for love and belonging. You're desperate for validation. And the message is often toughen up, attack the feminine. So the feminine side inside me is a very small, very hurt, very helpless little girl that is expecting to be rejected, is expecting to be shamed, is expecting to be humiliated and made fun of, and expecting to be patronized and not taken seriously. Oh, he's obviously very immature. He's still a bit feminine. Wait till he grows up into the real world. So this is a deep wound. And going out into the dating field, which is a very vulnerable terrain because we have, statistically, abusive and frightening templates of romantic relationship and parenthood. And then we have the cruelty of high school, the sociopathic element in high school. And then women who have been shamed and humiliated for being feminine hate their own femininity in America. And are determined to prove the opposite. I'm independent. I don't care about guys. I don't want to fall in love. I'm just having fun. These are not native, organic, kind of spontaneous emergences out of the psyche. This comes from sustained cultural programming. And if a woman has to give up her own feminine side and is constantly kind of lower ranked, She's patronized, but lower ranked in the feminine aspects. Then if a man expresses that, I think some of the rage at having to give up one's own femininity and have to shut it down and suppress it goes at wanting to attack the femininity in men, because men are very vulnerable in that terrain, again, through the cult programming. And so, so the most valuable thing for me was to find a woman who loved her little girl, because that meant she could love the little girl inside me, that got arrested at young ages and was afraid of being hit, afraid of being shouted at, afraid of being ostracized and humiliated. And, that horror of horror, being unique, being weird, which all anyone needs to say to an American teenager is, "You're weird." And they shrivel up inside at some level, because that means you're on the outside. That means you're not one of us. We're not going to let your uniqueness belong to our cult. And sociologically, ecologically, scientifically, the more biodiverse an ecology, the more resilient it is, and the better its odds of survival. That's true in nature. It's also true within the psyche. The more biodiverse a culture is, the more distinct uniqueness it is, the better the odds of the culture growing, thriving, and surviving. So it is from a place of ignorance, cruelty, and chauvinism that's murdered off to try and fit people as much as possible into boxes of a status quo to protect from the sociopathic element, which is primarily directed towards the feminine in men and patronized, in women. So, so that's been a definite focus. And for some time, I focused on, as I say, really breaking the mold. My mother didn't talk. I figured out that, in a good relationship, you are talking, let's say, 80% of the time, and you're having sex, let's say, 10 or 20% of the time. So the quality of verbal sex has a much bigger impact on sustainable well-being than the quality of physical sex, just because of duration. But then there's also the fact that if you're hurting each other's feelings, don't understand each other, traumatizing each other, the body shuts down around your partner, and so sex can't be very good in any case. So what I've been looking at more recently is the fact that in order for a relationship to be meaningful and growth-oriented, the most important thing an individual can do is take the inner conversation of the inner masculine and the inner feminine and externalize it in a dialectic, in a conversation. And here we get into a big problem, because the cult has a set of rules and stipulations, etc., that you need to follow, and in a variety of different ways that says, a politically correct woman doesn't need a man, for example. Okay, that's all well and good. But what if the little girl inside that woman, growing up in one of our many dysfunctional households, was desperate for love and was routinely abandoned? Well, what that means is she's been traumatized by abandonment, and she has regressed, meaning parts of her at that age range where she was repeatedly abandoned didn't grow up. They were arrested, as all trauma freezes things in the biology. And what that means is that that part of her is going to stay frozen at that age in a place of desperate fear and needing to belong until she's able to have someone connect with her at 5 years old, at 6 years old, where she is frozen emotionally, and get help through the trauma, through the grief of losing a childhood, and be tender with her so that that part of her feels safe enough to leave the frozen state of dissociation, come back into the body, and then grow up with a new loving partner. And, in a male-female relationship, that is usually the male, but it doesn't matter. What's necessary for growth is that at the points where we are ignorant, at the points where we're traumatized, at the points where we're arrested at a certain age emotionally, and all you have to do is ask yourself 20 times a day, how old do I feel emotionally in the most vulnerable, meaning in the most real and authentic parts of myself? How old do I feel? That's the age where things have gotten stuck. It's very unusual in Western culture for there to be an integrated, meaning a fully emotionally embodied and present male and female at high at high upper ages, particularly in romantic relationships. It may be fine in work where you park your feelings at the door and where there's not more engaged. But these are very boring surface relationships. When you go deep into feelings, you have to connect with the ages that hold the most intense feelings. And so if you kind of see a series of frozen, traumatized conversations inside the psyche. My terror is frozen at 2 years old. Whenever some big thing happens, I feel 2 years old. My sense of rejection and unlovability is locked in place in a loop at 5 years old. My sense of shame and that I'm somehow not worthy as a feminine self is, in my 10s to 15. My fear of being violated by the masculine, is throughout my lifespan. These things happen when I express my most feminine side, either as a male or as a female. And so this is the circuitry inside the psyche. And the most meaningful relationships touch the deepest feelings. The deepest feelings in a traumatic culture are usually at young ages. And so in order to touch those deepest feelings, you can do one of two things. You can reenact the abuse pattern that created those feelings and those stuck places. And you will have intense, emotional, visceral reality. And particularly when abusive parents have relabeled their cruelty as love and for your own good, this is very easy to do because you're an emotionally illiterate American, you're a psychologically illiterate American, you're a traumatically illiterate American who's told to be positive and not focus on any of that stuff, that's not cool. We're told to be cool. And if you look at the empathic sociopathic continuum, being cool is close to being cold. And when you're frozen, that's when you're in a sociopathic state. That's when you're coming from the reptilian brainstem. That's when you're traumatized and dissociated. When you're frozen. And we laud the idea of being cool, which is generally nothing affects me, which means a lot of dissociation, a lot of dishonesty, a lot of social masks, because you're either in a profoundly reptilian sociopathic state where things really don't bother you because they were so upsetting when you were feeling that you decided that the safest way to manage the pain was just to cut those parts off, to trip a breaker and disconnect from the high emotional charges that are in that region of the psyche. And so this is done all the time. What are you feeling? I don't know. Some part of you knew before it was cut off. And so not knowing what one feels or being numb is a symptom of profound trauma that is in an unrepaired, unintegrated state. And from that perspective, reenacting the wound, which in our culture is the masculine self violating the feminine self in men and in women. And sexuality is predicated on emotional and physical intensity. But the biggest organ in sexuality is the brain. And the highest states of flow come from peak emotional intensity. And so there's two ways to engage the masculine and feminine in peak emotional intensity. And the easiest one and the default one is to reenact the sociopathic chauvinistic abuse protocol of the masculine towards the feminine, which in our culture has often been males hurting females, males humiliating females, males demeaning the feelings in females. But at a deeper level, it's the masculine identity shaming and abusing the feminine identity. And so if a pathologically chauvinistically abused male wants to connect deeply emotionally with a woman, the easiest default path is to find a woman who is willing to be shamed and abused and violated in the same way that his own feminine self has been shamed and abused and violated, and reenact that childhood drama. And this will often produce incredibly intense sex because it's real. You've found someone to take the inner conversation of the masculine violating the feminine, and you found someone to bring that conversation to life with in the outside world, in which you can now occupy the masculine pole. And it's very vulnerable because men are shamed even more than women. It's very vulnerable for the male to take the feminine pole, because as soon as he goes into the feminine side in himself, he feels shame. He feels helpless. He feels small. He feels uncertain. He feels needy. And these are all of the qualities that both the men around him and the women around him are most likely to attack him for. There's an incredible cruelty and hostility directed at the feminine. And it's too much for an emotionally illiterate male that's told that they don't have really, have any feelings, to be feeling desperately needy and helpless by a woman who he's told is less than him. It's just too much. And so usually the male will occupy the masculine role and find a female who will accept the violation that he's already doing to his own feminine self, unconsciously, usually at this point. And if she does, he will feel intense sexual arousal. So if he rapes his own femininity, if he dishonors the boundaries, like if his feminine side says, no, that's a cruel joke, don't make that, but his masculine side wants to look cool in a butch, chauvinistic male cult with his buds, he's going to tell the joke anyway, and a small part of him that he pushes away feels unworthy, unlovable, unvaluable, because she said she didn't like the way that felt, but he did it anyway. It's a violation. It's a rape. It's a dishonor of what's inside. Now, if he's done that 10,000 times to himself, and if he's had that done 10,000 times to him, and particularly if he's got this, this very heavy shame around being a real man, then in order for him to connect with himself through a relationship in which the feminine is externalized, he's going to do one of two things. He's going to split and have an inauthentic relationship with his partner that doesn't feel very emotionally connected but is culturally and politically correct. And this is the schizophrenia. It's a schizophrenia, that is often expressed in the polarity between the hooker and the wife. When he has sex with the hooker, he is not bound by the cult dictates of how to treat a woman. And he treats the hooker exactly the way he treats his own feminine self. And as a result, both his abused feminine self and his abused masculine self are present in the reenactment of the abuse, creating lots of emotional charge, creating lots of physical stimulation. And then you have this kind of crazy-making conundrum where the man says, I love my wife, she's the perfect wife, but I lust after the slut, the hooker, the person who I allow myself to treat exactly the way my masculine self treats my feminine self. And this is indeed, it's not a loving relationship that's fostered by the cult. It's a relationship of violation. And so if you want to have a loving relationship as protocoled by the cult, first of all, it's impossible without doing that inner work. It's just an idea. You should open the door and be polite and, dear, would you like to have sex? And let's just, whatever's comfortable for you. But that's not how he's treating his feminine self on the inside. And so it's not what he's thinking and feeling. He's thinking, this fucking bitch, why do I have to be so polite to this woman when I'm so rude to this woman in here? And why do I have to be so polite to this woman when this woman and my parents and my buds are so brutal to the woman in here? There's a resentment because there's a double standard. The feminine in here is treated like shit, and now the perfect wife is somehow above all that. It's a very schizophrenic, disconnected relationship. And so here you'll have a going through the motions. So what is marriage? Marriage is, first of all, it's not a bit of paper. Marriage is the pairing of the masculine and the feminine inside each person, connecting with the masculine and feminine inside the other at each of the different ages. The ideal marriage has my 5-year-old getting along with your 5-year-old. That means being silly. 5-year-olds, are not analytic, talking about politics. But again, the cult demeans the femininity in children. Young children and very elderly people that are open to a lot of wonder and innocence are in the feminine stages of the cycle of life, with the masculine stage being in the most extroverted, period of 20s and 30s and, and 40s, and then it slowly moves towards the feminine again. And so if my 5-year-old would like to play with your 5-year-old, but you have hostility and patronizing hatred towards the playfulness of your 5-year-old because your playfulness was always hit. Get more serious. Do your homework. Grow up. The 5-year-old wasn't welcome at home. So as you got to be 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, you, as that inner 5-year-old wanted to come out, were strict and hard and told it, that it was useless, reenacting the abuse cycle. So now you're 20 and 30 and your 5-year-olds could play together. But one of you says, no, that's disgusting. That's immature. Grow up. I want a real man. Don't be silly. So now the 5-year-old is shamed, and all the wonder and loss, all the wonder and innocence of that 5-year-old in play is killed through shame and judgment. So the 5-year-olds are not married. And what about the 6-year-old? What about the 6-year-old that's beginning to learn a little bit more about the world and and both 5 and 6-year-olds are very needy emotionally. But I don't like needy men or needy women. Those needy women, I don't want them. So now the 5 and 6-year-olds know they have no home in the relationship. They're not married. Now, every single one of the inner ages, they're like rings in a tree. They don't disappear. They're there as part of the psychic landscape. Inside the 2,000-year-old redwood is still the 1-year-old core, assuming it's not hollow and rotten. And that core gives it its strength. And that pattern stays the same unless there's a re-engagement or a regrowth of that region. You can kind of look at the inner ages as landscape architecture, that your parents landscaped the inner ages using their dominance and their ability to bribe and bully by controlling survival, security, love and belonging, and self-esteem. And whether they did that because they believed it was a good idea, or whether they did it unconsciously because that was what was done for them, or whether they think it's a bad idea, but they still need to choreograph you to prepare for the cult that they don't agree with, but feel that you need to belong to this cult to survive and feel secure and have love and belonging and esteem in the cult. In any case, the parents, the teachers, the cult landscapes, usually at least until 15 or so, and so these regions within the psyche are formed into a template, into a certain pattern that defaults to being profoundly chauvinistic, and given the amount of trauma in our cult's history and present day, it defaults to a traumatized, chauvinistic relationship between the masculine and the feminine. Now, as you enter a new relationship, there is a reawakening and a re-going through these stages in a healthy new relationship. It starts out in the innocence of new love and trust in the other. And if that has been brutalized too much, it starts out with a protection. I'm not going to be innocent. I'm not going to love. I want to jump straight to the older years that aren't as painful. But in doing so, you give up large portions of the marriage because they're not flowing in those domains. They're being hit with judgment, hostility, and cruelty, and a lot of the life and energy in the relationship is just dead. So then what you have is an intellectual idea that replaces this. My media, my peers, my movies say that a woman should like this type of man, and that's clearly that type of man. So that's the kind of man I should like, so that's the kind of man I will pursue. But it's in pursuit of a false god. It's in pursuit of an idea. And one can be infatuated with an idea and be out of touch with oneself. And as long as that meets enough agendas in present day time, where this part of me wants to look cool, the cult says that these people are cool, so I want one of those so that I can look cool. So the current age has a marriage, so to speak. You'll make me look cool. I want to look cool, so I want you. And I want you to do these things and not do these things, because these things that you do make me look cool because they make you look cool and I'm associated with you. And these things that you do, you don't look cool, so then I don't look cool. So I've got to, manipulate you to some extent to meet my agenda. It's not a love relationship. It's an agenda and an idea-based relationship. And as proximity deepens, there is an innate desire within every psyche to be symmetrical, to be honored, to be seen, to survive, to feel secure, to have love and belonging. Each of the inner personas and each of the inner ages, they had an authentic, optimal expression that never fully occurs, and then they have an adaptation. And you don't get free of the adaptation of a 5-year-old that's learned, for example, maybe by age 3, blurting out the truth. You've been shushed and hit and left in the car, etc., because the truth was not welcome in your cult. The truth was embarrassing to mom. So then you develop an adaptation. Okay, what I'm really thinking and feeling is unloved, is unwanted. And so what mom points at and says that, why don't you be like this girl, or smiles when I do this, guides me to start a manipulative or an adaptive relationship that says, oh, mom, you're such a wonderful mom, and you like it when I smile and do a little twirl and this, and oh, you like that. Okay. If that's what I need to be in order to survive, feel secure, have love and belonging and self-esteem in the first 4 hierarchies of human needs, okay, I will adapt. And so what we're left with is the adaptive personas, and what's lost is the original authentic self. So our template is largely adaptive. And then the question is, can our partner love the adaptive personas as they are? Because if not, there's a certain message, the child made those adaptations under the clear visceral awareness that they might not survive, they might not feel secure. And so there's a fear of death that comes with reverting to the authentic self. Every trauma reprograms an individual into an adaptive persona that can survive the sociopathic elements in the environment, or the trauma is healed and they revert back to the authentic self. One of the benefits of a marriage is to create a security, the safety of a container that is solid enough, empathic, intimate, and loving enough that the adaptive personas and personalities can be explored together and understood in the context of a family history. And you can actually revert back to the authentic self which is always more beautiful and symmetrical than the adaptive persona, and is always healthier, it's more intelligent. Because the psyche gives birth to the personas that are most medicinal for the level of asymmetry and toxicity in the environment around it. But there's a tension between what a family system needs to be healthy and what a family system wants as a coping mechanism to survive trauma in a sociopathic culture. There's the medicine that the family system and the community and the culture needs. And then there is the fear of change that every traumatic or traumatized culture holds. And so in that tension, it is the culture that dictates what will occur in a child. Because traumatized cultures fear change to such an extent that when a parent has the ability to just snuff out a truth or push that away or use the reinforcement of their family system to say, no, this is the way you need to be, they will almost always use that power, and the child cannot compete. It's one of the blessings of, for example, Down syndrome children or Asperger's children that cannot be programmed. And you could even see this as a medicinal thing, meaning your family system has gotten so sick and so ossified in an asymmetrical shape, meaning, for example, the feminine is undervalued, the masculine is overvalued. That's asymmetrical. Grace lies in symmetry. That's why we have wheels rather than squares on our cars. Grace lies in balance and symmetry. And the most important balance and symmetry is between the masculine and the feminine. And so, to the degree that there is a relationship, first of all, is to the degree that each of the ages inside connect with each of the ages outside. So that determines the amount of contact, the amount of authentic contact. The degree to which the inner conversation is one of violation versus one of love and support and empathy determines how healthy that contact or that marriage is. So you can have an abuse marriage where, my masculine 5-year-old hates your 5-year-old feminine self because he hates his own feminine self. And the masculine side of your 5-year-old hates the feminine side in my 5-year-old. So there's lots of connection. Every age connects in some form of hostility, in some form of judgment and dissociation. So it's a meaningful marriage, meaning that you found a partner that accurately expresses and exhibits the internal abuse pattern that was shoved down your throat and reflects the template often in the mother-father relationship. And at one level, one could say this is progress, because in a chauvinistic culture, what is inside is ignored and trivialized, and what is outside is important and is real. So when you have that chauvinism that says the inner world isn't real, the outer world is real, you can't really work on your inner masculine and feminine relationship until you take the abuse system that is inside of you, all the different ways that your masculine side is abusing the feminine side, all the different ways that the feminine side is dissociating, going crazy, addicting to numb pain, etc., etc. So you externalize this, and it feels very real. It's like, this is real. Something feels solid about it, because you've got a partner that is accurately playing out the role play of the internal abuse conversation. And so it will be a very intense, very difficult relationship, because it is a very intense, difficult relationship. And you could say that that's a step forward, because now it's conscious. As long as you understand that what's conscious is what's going on inside. And as long as you understand that we want reality. Some of us are so terrified of touching in with the trauma and feeling certain things that we don't want reality. We want a fantasy that doesn't actually connect with us. It connects with an idea. So this is a safety mechanism to avoid dealing with traumatic reality that we're not able or willing. We're just too terrified to face it. So I want a fantasy. Here's the man who would rather watch porn than talk with a real person, or a sex robot. It's like, I'll take that any day rather than face the pain that's inside, or the fear of not knowing how to deal with this inside. So I don't know how to deal with this on the outside. And part of the problem with the split is I've been taught to abuse the inner feminine, but now we're in a culture where if I abuse the outer feminine, I'm a criminal. It's not a crime to be abused by my parents and my cult in my feminine side as a man, but it is a crime to take that very real template that's going on in the present moment of a profound self-hating, hostile relationship. It's fine. If you want to kill yourself, live in misery, be depressed, that's not a crime, because we're a chauvinistic cult. The inner world doesn't matter. But it's a really big deal if you want to shout at, judge, criticize the female on the outside. And so we've got a split. And if the split is maintained, meaning I treat this woman like the appropriate, feminist person that, I'm supposed to do. I've learned, feminists have told me, do this and don't do this and do this and don't do this. Okay, I've learned the rules. Okay, I'll do this and this and this. It just has very little feeling. And there's a longing to somehow connect. And there's a sense that I'm doing all the rules, but it's not connecting. And so from that perspective, you could say it's successful to play out the internal abuse on the outside. Because if it's real, if there's a real connection, it's doing this for both people. Meaning the female has a highly abusive masculine persona in her that is constantly telling her that she's a piece of shit. And there's and then there's a feminine side in her that feels like shit. And she won't feel fully sane until she finds, in her own chauvinism of focusing on the outer world as real and the inner world as nothing, until she finds a male who will treat her like shit in the same way her own masculine side treats her feminine side like shit. And the male won't feel kind of connected or grounded with reality until he finds a woman where he talks to her on the outside like he talks with her on the inside. And this is the horror and the integration of most real relationships. When real feelings get involved, you can have a nice fantasy, you can have a projection, you can fall in love with an idea, not a human being, and you can do all that. But when the relationship gets serious is when the ages actually connect. So one metric is that all the ages are actually connected. But the real pivot in terms of moving towards healthy relationship is an adult present in the connection. Because the adult is the part that loves, honors, respects, integrates, learns from, and serves both the masculine and the feminine part within. Meaning most of our parents, most of our culture is formed by regressed children in sibling rivalry, in envy, in all kinds of competitive manipulations, etc., and all kinds of game playing. And there's no adult present. And so there's no adult to raise the child. So it becomes very difficult to find an adult when you've never met one. The adult is the one who takes responsibility, meaning has the ability and the willingness to respond, to help each part of the psyche survive, feel secure, have a sense of love and belonging, have a sense of self-esteem, develop its unique gifts within the psyche, bring those gifts up into the psyche and create abundance, and be part of something bigger than the individual persona. A very healthy child that feels seen and honored and is attuned to by an adult wants to be a part of something bigger than themselves, wants to serve to a certain extent the parent's life, aspires to grow up. The adult has nothing to do with age. You can't be an adult at 6 years old, but you can be 50 years old and be a 6-year-old grown-up that doesn't know how to love itself and doesn't know how to love anyone else. So the adult is the one capable of responding. So that when the 6-year-old says, "I'm scared, that woman just shouted at me, is she going to hit me?" The adult says, "I'll be with you. I won't let her hit you. If she gets abusive, we'll withdraw, we'll set boundaries. This isn't your fault. That's a child out there that this cult abused. And so she doesn't know how to take care of 6 years old. The only protocol that she learned was to shame the innocence of the 6-year-old or the needs or neediness of the 6-year-old. So she's not competent to be a parent for you or an adult. I'll do that." And the adult is also the only one having integrated the self to some extent that is then capable of loving another human being. Oh, you've got a 5-year-old that's very needy inside. "No, I don't. I'm a feminist. I don't have needs. I don't need a man." Okay, I understand. You're a teenager who feels ashamed of your 5-year-old. Now, will you let me love your 5-year-old? "No, I won't." I see. Okay, well, you may not be ready for an adult relationship, but I'm not going to stand by and participate in the abuse that you're dishing on your 5-year-old. I love that 5-year-old. And if you'll allow me to teach you, look at how beautiful she is. Look at the way that she can cry and then just let everything go. You don't know how to do that, but she does at 5 years old. She's beautiful. And just look at how much energy your 8-year-old has. You're exhausted, sure, because you're judging yourself and running around with all the things you're doing wrong according to your abuse cult. But your 8-year-old, just boundless energy and goes for things. I like that 8-year-old. And so there needs to be one adult present to teach the children inside and out what it's like to be an adult. No, you don't abuse that part of yourself. You lift that part up. And so the opportunity in a marriage is both to come together and bring the inner relationship and make it conscious. To understand that if it is a meaningful emotional relationship, the reason you are together is because everything that's going on outside is going on in here. Now, if you don't connect with your partner at all emotionally, then they don't mirror your inner conversation. The reason you connect emotionally with a romantic partner is because they're close enough to your template that as you relate, you externalize the feminine masculine dialectic that's going on inside on the outside. And so if you're very emotionally drawn, but notice there's a lot of abuse, you need to learn to be an adult for yourself and perhaps teach your partner to be an adult, since our culture doesn't raise adults. And you will know that your partner is an adult when they respond with a mixture of informed discipline, nurturing care, understanding, and attunement to the parts in you that are needy, that are scared, that are vulnerable, that are creative, that are atypical, that don't fit the cult script, thank God. You know, we're not dealing with such a boring relationship. So you'll know you're dealing with an adult when you share something meaningful to you and your partner gives survival, lets that part of you exist, gives security, lets that part feel like it's not going to be banished, gives love and belonging, a sense of, I'd like to get to know you and understand you, and gives a sense of self-esteem. You have a right to exist. You, persona, if you're an adaptive persona, you kept this person alive through a sociopathic environment. And you've done your job. You've now gotten to a relationship where I'm here. You've done your job. You can let go. And I want to see who you wanted to be before you were forced to follow party lines. I want to see who you really are. And I want to love that person. I want to see your beauty, your truth, your goodness, your authenticity. I trust and believe in that. And I'm not going to let the abuse taskmaster in this person shut you down. And I'm going to teach this partner how to love you. That's what I'm going to do. And this is a point of rupture or of growth. Meaning, if the attachment is to the identification of the abuser primarily, of the masculine, then this threatens crisis because it brings the abuse survivor into unknown, an unknown future, an unknown identity. And so if you're trying to be loving to someone and you know what love is as an adult because you've brought love and integration into yourself, if you're trying to be loving to someone because you know what it is, and they push you away as the abuser, you'll find in most highly abusive families, if you advocate for the child, the one of the parents will come and attack you. I'm going to call the police. Don't mess with my children. How dare you try and parent? Unfortunately, this culture gives legal authority to regress children, to abuse their actual children. And so, that's what happens when the identification is with the abuser. So if you try and love your partner and they punish you and tell you that's not who they are and blah, 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 and try and hide themselves, that's a shame cult. I'm unlovable, so I'm not going to let you see me, and if you try, I'm going to attack you because I know I'm unlovable, and so my only hope is to get pseudo-love by pretending to be something different. If you try and actually love who I am, I will attack you, because someone who believes they're unlovable because they don't love themselves, and no one has ever loved them, they cannot conceive that there would be any reason to see them other than to shame them and hurt them. Because the last time that part of them was seen, an abusive parent or sibling or teacher shamed and hurt them. So their survival strategy is to be invisible, because it's a world where that part of them is loved doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist in the culture. Most of the psychic landscape is abused and violated and raped by the culture with the same discipline and efficiency with which we rape and abuse the planet, which is the feminine state. You have the individual, and then you have the host body, the planet, that gives life to the individual. When you rape, pollute, and violate your host body, it's speaking of a level of maturity. You're not an adult. Only cancers kill off their host body, and they die shortly after. So, if someone is committed to attacking you for loving them, you can either be patient, or you can say, okay, I'm going to find someone else who's closer to my template, who likes playing with 5-year-olds and 6 years old and likes being sensitive. And when they feel needy, they say, I'm needy, please love me. And a partner says, I'd love to love you. How can I hug you and hold you? It's like, yes, that's a marriage. When my 5-year-old feels scared, you give him a hug. And there's a lot of hostility around this. I think it's a little bit of a cult cover for our inadequacy to love, our inadequacy to be adults, is simply to attack need. I am not your mother. If you don't love the 5-year-old, you don't get their wonder in the marriage. It's that simple. If you're an idiot, you will delete, destroy, shame, judge many parts in your partner, and they will regress, and they will become hostile towards the relationship, and they will undermine it. And so, for example, a woman with a stern husband, that does a good job of reenacting her internal chauvinistic masculine towards her feminine, may pick the husband because he's constantly doing what her internal masculine and father did. You're undisciplined, you're too feminine, you're wild, you're this, you rotten woman, grow up. And so she may pick that because it's familiar. But the inner ages that are constantly being harassed and criticized and shamed hate the masculine in her and hate the husband. So she may just have an affair with an artist, right, who likes to play with her 5-year-old. And she won't take it too seriously because she's too chauvinistic herself. So anyone who loves her feminine self, can't be, but he's just an artist. And so she'll find an affair or something to actually give her inner child some love and play and passion that she won't give herself, and that her husband that mirrors her inner masculine won't give her either. And so it's a secret, an illicit kind of way, and the inner child are always trying to rebel and attack the system that her older self is trying to impose. So it's a war within the self, and then it's a war within the marriage, and it's a war with the culture. So the possibility of a marriage is to create a safe enough container with enough integrity and intensity to create heat and reliquefy some of these templates and intensively bring in a new adult relationship with the inner self inside and within the adult self, and relationship within the inner self and the partner. This takes a lot of work because our cult is trying to be cool. And the amount of heat, the amount of emotional intensity needed to reliquefy a template is by definition not cool. It's not normal, it's not cool, it's frowned upon. And you will find, peer groups, for example, being very suspicious of a couple that are getting too hot together and beginning to change, like, don't change yourself, don't do that, because it's shaking the cult superstructure. The sense that we're all supposed to stay the same and, use the super judge and all that to keep all the inner parts in order. Because if we don't, the big bully, the government, the parent, the peer group, the company, will not let us survive, will not let us feel secure, will not have a sense of love and belonging. And so there's always this sense, the culture is the biggest parent. And we want to be politically correct so that the cult will not release its wrath, will not withdraw financial, social, and other support from the relationship. And the family. If dad's a chauvinistic bastard as much as he ever was, and you want to marry a nice feminine artist, then what? If you want support from the family, you're going to tell them to be tough and don't talk about your paintings and don't do this and all that because dad's going to punish you. So you're going to have to learn to hide, just like I hide my feminine side from dad because it'll upset him, right? And so you coach your partner on how to fit in to the family asymmetries and abuse patterns so that they'll let you survive. So there's a sense of sneaking and all that. Usually, if you have two adults who know how to love and integrate within the psyche, you're intelligent enough to engage with the cult in the way that you need to make money or whatever. Maybe you have your own business or whatever, but you also know that the cult is not very healthy because it doesn't teach you or know how to do many of the things you know how to do to love yourself and your partner. The cult is not your friend. It's a status quo that protects one from chaos, feminine, the unknown, feminine, change, feminine. Chauvinistic, traumatized cults are terrified of the feminine, terrified of the unknown, and will do just about everything in a feverish, addictive pitch, to not break that, break that pattern. And so one of the challenges if you marry someone who is healthier than you, meaning they know how to love some part of themselves that you don't know how to love that part of them because you don't know how to love that part of you, is that you may mentally be able to navigate and relate and say, I want to be that person, I just don't feel and don't connect that I, in a way that I am. One thing that's been going on, interestingly in my marriage is it's been a process of opening up and getting to know the feminine parts in me that are the abused feminine parts in my wife. And so by championing her feminine side, I learned to champion my own feminine side, and so we both grow, dramatically. She's had a part that is silent, that I've never been able to relate to until very recently. And so very recently, I was able to find the terrified feminine part in me that won't talk because she knows she'll get in trouble, and she knows she's helpless, and she knows no one will love her. And so the abusive masculine in me is very impatient with that part in me. Come on, get over it, do this, do that. And similarly, the abusive masculine in me is very impatient with that part of my wife. Come on, say something. You're not a 2-year-old. Speak. But it turns out one of the reasons we're married is I do have a 2-year-old that's as terrified and silent as hers. And I have a lot of healing to do in that terrain because there was a lot of trauma, that occurred at that age. And so, it's when we're as chauvinistic as we are, it's hard for me to deal with that directly on the inside. But just knowing that everything my wife is doing, everything that she's being, reflects some part of me. And that if I want those parts to grow and mature, I need to understand them, see them, empathize and attune to them in a way that lifts the burden off that 2-year-old inside and out, that makes it safe to say what were the unsayable things, so that I can learn to love and connect in more and more rich ways. And one of the things that she's doing is writing a book, just for me, just every day a chapter, so that I can start learning and empathizing and putting together the pieces with her. And of course, those mirror the pieces in me. And so I can start seeing how to love myself in that terrain. I did a therapy session recently where I wouldn't let the therapist see myself. I wouldn't let her see my face. And this is very atypical because, I'm right out there and transparent as I identify myself 99% of the time. But that's because I've dissociated and am hiding the part of me that is too terrified to do that. So it's very easy to be outgoing and say everything completely, candidly, and you can ask me anything you want if you've dissociated the parts of yourself that are terrified of being seen. But as soon as those parts come in, if I honor those parts, I've got to say, be authentic and turn away and tell my therapist, you can't see me today. I'm going to hide. Don't look at me. And then see what that part has to say. And of course, if my therapist is an idiot, she will judge that part of me that she's already judged in herself, and she'll tell me to be mature and this, we can't do this. And no, I have a good therapist. So she doesn't see me at all for a session. And we just talk for a while. And that part of me is very scared and needs to be hummed to by a nurturing feminine energy. And so my therapist hums to me and is kind to me and sends love until that part feels safe to come out. Now, when it comes out, we have a marriage, in this case between me and the therapist. The fact that the therapist can love this part in herself and she can love this part in me lets this part in me feel that she can survive in that marriage, in that relationship, that she's secure, that she's has a sense of love and belonging and honor. And that part feels loyal to the therapist, feels loyal to and feels love for the therapist, because that's the first time she's been out. And that part also feels loyal to my wife, because that part didn't trust me, meaning my abusive masculine side didn't trust me until I started being kind to my wife in that part. And so there's kind of a dance going on around that. So I would say that, a good 90% of marriage is constantly getting to know the new blossoms within the psyche that are always coming out as medicine for the asymmetries and toxicities of the adaptive personas that have been needed to survive within the cult. Getting to know those parts and then forming, nurturing, partnering relationship. Partnering relationship is when the masculine side serves the feminine side. When the feminine side says, I'm scared, and the masculine says, tell me about it. I'd like to listen. Well, I'm scared of this and this and that. What made you scared of that? What happened to you that made that so scary? And then the older part say, thank you for trusting us. We're going to take care of you. Do you need to be held? Do you need to be loved? And the abuse cult has no patience. It gets in a rage. This is going to take too much time. So immature. All the judgments, all the defenses, why not to love an infant? If there weren't so many abusive resistances to loving an infant, we wouldn't be needing to do this at age 40. Our parents would have done it. If they shut down at age 2, there's a reason. And the reason is that there's nothing wrong with that child. The reason is there's something wrong with the cult that produced the parent, that produced the abuse, that attacked that part to such a point where it dissociated and felt like it was threatening survival just to exist. You don't blame the child. You hold the cult accountable for its cruelty, its stupidity. So life does not get interesting, or it doesn't get boring, in this framework. There's so many different sides to know in one's partner and in oneself, and there's so many ways to grow in loving, in each of those domains. Another thing with the container in marriage, I think that's really valuable is to, on the outside, to advocate and support one another in increasing survival. So that means having money in the bank, having investments in our cult, paying off debt, building skills, having security, more of the same. Having love and belonging, being able to locate healthy people, being able to love oneself, being able to grow the marriage stronger and stronger so there's a support when the cult tries to abuse certain parts. Our cult does not know how to honor large portions of the psyche. So you go out and you share those parts in the cult. They're dishonored, violated, humiliated, ignored, invisible. And it hurts. Those parts want to retreat. So the marriage can be a place to say, well, I will be the one person in this cult who validates the beauty of this part of you. It's wonderful. But also, if you think of the logistics of outer living on the outer side, to see that every year, every month, let's say every month, your partner has a stronger chance of survival, has greater security, has more sense of love and belonging, that the marriage supports them in developing friendships that are meaningful, that they have more sense of self-esteem, that you're not tearing them down. Once you grasp that what you're doing to your partner is an expression of what you're doing in yourself, it becomes an opportunity to learn something, to learn self-love. It's unusual to find an adult, so takes some work. In a good marriage, you become more of an adult through loving your partner, through putting something ahead of the narcissistic agenda of a child or adolescent. And the metric for adult love is supporting your partner to be their best self in the world. That's moving towards the highest of our human needs, to be a part of something transcendent. That's what the adult is. The adult is transcendent. It's the synergy. It's not the child, the adolescent, the young adult. It's got all of those pieces with the ability to love all of those pieces, which means to advocate for the healthy honor of all of those pieces. So these are my current paradigms for marriage. And I feel incredibly lucky to have found an incredibly sensitive, vulnerable, feminine female that mirrors in so many ways the wounded feminine in me. And so I learn from her so that I can start learning from myself. She has dreams. And when I listen to those dreams and make changes, our marriage gets better. That's feminine intelligence. When she listens to my logic and reason, her life gets better. That's masculine intelligence. When she learns to internalize that to where her masculine is a healthy, loving adult who is serving her inner feminine, then she's independent. Now you've got true freedom, where you can maintain that self-love out of relationship and recognize another person capable of loving you. So it's a really exciting journey. And one of the things that I enjoy about being in a marriage, thinking about the future, is both of us developing more and more skills and resources, inner and outer, that make our future stronger together. My life is, 5-10 times stronger because of the resources and skills that she's always learning and bringing into the relationship. There's a synergy that is possible with two people, and that synergy is undervalued because the synergy is largely in feminine terrain, a relationship. A business acquisition. Oh, we can help you do this, and that'll make billions of dollars. That's overvalued. Because you can have billions of dollars in an abuse relationship and know nothing about love and adulthood. But to be able to build a partnership where this would help our relationship 5 years from now if you start building this skill. Okay, I'm going to build it, and then our relationship is stronger 5 years from now than it was today. It's an exciting journey, and it's a paradigm that nobody has ever articulated to me, but it is a paradigm that is working.